Hello everyone. In this session, let us see how an expense can be defined as a revenue expenditure or capital expenditure or a deferred capital expenditure. So with an example problem, I'll explain how we can treat an expense as revenue, capital or deferred revenue expenditure. See the question here. The first one, legal charges incurred in connection with the purchase of land. Which type of expenditure this is? Whether it is a capital or revenue expenditure. This is definitely a capital expenditure. Why? As I said in the last video that any cost incurred for purchase of any fixed asset, then cost of additions or extensions of fixed assets if any, expenses in regarding purchase of any fixed assets or expenses in connection with the installation of fixed assets. All such are capital expenditures because they are all non-recurring in nature and huge amounts are spent on such expenses. Therefore, any legal charges incurred in connection with the purchase of land, this is an expense in connection with the purchase of a fixed asset. So that this is a capital expenditure. The second one, brokerage paid for raising of a loan for the purpose of business. This is a capital expenditure. Why? Because this is in connection with the loan for a business. This is a non-recurring expense and only while raising the loans such brokerages are paid. Therefore, this is a capital expenditure. The third one, carriage paid on newly acquired machinery. Machinery is one of the fixed assets and carriages is an expense in connection with the purchase of fixed asset or to bringing the fixed asset from the place of supply to the place of business premises. So that this is a capital expenditure. As we know that all the capital expenditures should not be treated as an expense to the business concern. Instead of that, we have to consider all those as assets. In the sense, concerned expenditure must be debited to the asset account but not to the concerned expense account. Therefore, carriages paid on newly acquired machinery has to be debited to machinery account but not to the carriages account. Then the next one is expenses incurred for whitewashing the buildings. Whether this is a capital expenditure? No, because whitewashing of building is purely the expenses incurred for maintenance of the building. Suppose we incur expense for the purpose of maintenance of any fixed asset, that cannot be considered as a capital expenditure. It is a revenue expenditure. Therefore, the expenses incurred for whitewashing the building has to be debited to such an expense account but not to the asset account or building account. The next is wages paid to workmen engaged in construction of buildings. Once again, this is relating to construction of a fixed asset. The huge expense which is incurred for construction of fixed asset will be considered as capital expenditure. In the sense, expenses incurred for construction or building a building or any business premises. Therefore, this is a capital expenditure to be debited to building account but not to the wages account. Amount spent on repairs to a second-hand motor car before it is used. Which type of expense this is? Repair charges. We cannot consider it as revenue expenditure. Why? Because it is an expenditure which is incurred on second-hand motor car which is not put to use earlier. Suppose such expenses incurred, then it increases the productivity of such a motor car. Therefore, this is considered as capital expenditure and to be debited to motor car account but not to the repair charges account. The next is expenses incurred for erecting a new machine. As I said earlier, any cost of installation of any of the assets will be considered as a capital expenditure. This is not a revenue expenditure, and whenever it becomes a capital expenditure, definitely it has to be debited to machinery account but not to the expense account. Next one, brokerage paid for the purpose of purchasing shares. So this is all about cost of investment. This is an expenditure incurred on investments. Investments, one of the assets. So any expenses incurred regarding the purchase of any asset will be considered as capital expenditure to be debited to investment account but not to the expense account. Next is periodical repairs of plant. This is purely maintenance of plant but not relating to the acquisition or construction or expenses relating to the purchase of any fixed asset. It is just day-to-day maintenance of a plant, so that any repair charges for the maintenance of plant will be considered as revenue expenditure. So it must be debited to the repairs account but not to the plant account. The next one is cost of maps purchased by a college. In any educational institutions, the maps will be considered as an asset, so that will be treated as a capital expenditure but not the revenue expenditure. Moreover, the maps will not be purchased by a college repeatedly. So all such expenses are for an educational institutions are capital expenditures. So in this way, we can identify any expense is of which type, whether it is a revenue expense or capital expense or deferred revenue expenditure. If it is a revenue expenditure, we can debit such expenditures to the income and expenditure account, and if it is a capital expenditure, we can debit such expenditure to a concerned fixed asset account. So, hope you understood what I discussed here. Thank you.